Corgi, German Shepherd, Shih Tzu. These dogs are different breeds but can be considered as one species dogs. If they're of the same species, how come they came in different variety of different breeds? This is called speciation, when a new type of plant or animal species is created. This we can explain by discussing the different reproductive isolating mechanisms. There are two types of reproductive isolating mechanisms, prezygotic barrier and postzygotic barrier. Prezygotic barriers are obstacles that are present before an egg can be fertilized. So, according from our class's discussion earlier last week, we have 5 common prezygotic barriers. Number 1 is geographical isolation. It is a separation between populations of the same species by barriers of the physical sorts. For example, are barriers created by rivers, oceans, and mountains. An example for this barrier is the kaibab squirrel. It is a subspecies of the Abert squirrel that was formed when a small population became isolated on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. The next barrier is temporal isolation. It refers to the differences of species, timing, and reproductive events that prevents them from mating and producing an offspring. An example of this is between two closely related cystids of the genus Muscicida in the United States. Although they are perfectly capable to mate, they can't because one species of genus Muscicida only matures after 13 years while the other sexually matures after 17 years. The third barrier is behavioral isolation. It is when the certain signals and mating rituals prevent two closely related species from mating and producing an offspring. For example, female spiders only mate when a male of the same species taps her web in a particular way. This prevents that female spider from mating with other spiders outside their species. The fourth barrier is mechanical isolation. It is when the species are prevented from mating because of their reproductive organs' differences, therefore enabling them from producing offspring. Example of this barrier is if a female of one species of snail tries to mate with the male snail of another species. Their reproductive organs won't match with one another and the two species won't be able to mate. For the last barrier, we have the gametic isolation. It is when the species gametes, the egg and the sperm cell meet but no fertilization happens. An example of this is when two species of sea urchin, the red sea urchin and the purple sea urchin, tries to mate but because of their gametes are not compatible, no interbreeding occurred. Those are the prezygotic barrier. Moving on to the postzygotic barrier, it is when the mechanism blocks the reproduction after the fertilization occurred and the zygote was formed. There are 3 types of prezygotic barrier. Number 1 is the hybrid inviability. It is when the gametes of two different species may combine but the genetic information is not enough to carry the organism through normal development. The organism will eventually die after or before hatching or birth. For example, is the hybrid between a sheep and a goat. The mating could be successful but their offspring could die in early ages of development before birth. Number 2 is the hybrid sterility. It is when a hybrid offspring survives into adulthood but ends up developing a low fertility and is unable to produce an offspring. An example of this is a cross between a horse and a donkey which produces a mule for their offspring, but a mule cannot mate and produce another mule. Lastly, number 3 is the hybrid breakdown. It is when two related species can hybridize and their F1 offspring are fertile. But successive generations like F2 and beyond suffer lower viability or fecundity. Thus, they cannot become an established population. Its example is a sterile mule produced from mating a horse and a donkey, or tigon from mating lion and tiger. In modes of speciation, as we previously tackled, speciation is how a new kind of plant or animal species is created. Speciation occurs when a group within a species separate from other members of its species and develop its own unique characteristics. There are 4 modes of speciation. Number 1 is allopatric speciation. Allo or other, it means that a physical separation happened to a species into 2 groups. This could happen due to geographical changes such as mountain building or social changes such as immigration. An example of this is the Isthmus Panama. It experienced geographical barrier and it separates the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Number 2 is parapatric speciation. Para or beside, it occurs when a new species evolve into contiguous yet spatially segregated habitats. Unlike allopatric speciation, the populations that are diverging during parapatric speciation maintain a zone of contact and do not cease the exchange of genes completely. The best known example of parapatric speciation occurs in population of grass Agrostis tenuis, which span miles tailings and normal soils. Individuals that are tolerant to heavy metals, a heritable trait, survive well on contaminated soil but poorly on non-contaminated soil. Number 3 is peripatric speciation. Peri or peripheral, which meant edge, this speciation meant that when a small group of individuals break off the larger group and form a new species. An example of this is the London underground mosquito, a variant of the mosquito Culex pipiens, which entered in the London underground in 19th century. Evidence for its speciation includes genetic divergence, behavioral differences, and difficulty in mating. Last is number 4, sympatric speciation. Sim or same, this speciation involves the splitting of an ancestral species into 2 or more reproductively isolated groups without geographical isolation of those. For example, the insect apple maggot fly is an example of sympatric speciation. Initially, the apple maggot fly lays their eggs on hawthorn fruit, a relative of apple. In the 19th century, a distinct form of maggot fly emerged that lays eggs on apples only. And that is the reproductive isolating mechanisms and modes of speciations that we discussed. I hope you learned something from our discussion and see you next time, learners. Bye!